Some of the most costly American casualties of World War II can be traced not only to enemy fire, but to controversial command decisions shaped by pressure, politics, and imperfect information. These aren't stories of cowardice or incompetence. These are stories of commanders who made choices that seemed reasonable at the time, or necessary, or unavoidable, but that led to casualties that survivors and historians would spend decades arguing were preventable. This is the story of 5 controversial command decisions in World War II that cost American lives. These are the orders that sparked courtroom debates, ended careers, and left widows asking, "Did my husband have to die for that?" 5. General Mark Clark's decision to prioritize Rome over destroying the German 10th Army, May 1944, Italian campaign. Estimated preventable casualties, thousands. In May 1944, the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula had stalled at the Gustav Line, a fortified German defensive position anchored on the monastery of Monte Cassino. After months of brutal fighting and multiple failed assaults, the Allies finally broke through. The Germans were retreating north in disarray. This was the moment that Allied planners had been waiting for. The plan was to use the 6th Corps, which had landed at Anzio months earlier and been bottled up in the beachhead, to cut off the retreating German 10th Army. If executed properly, the maneuver would trap tens of thousands of German soldiers in a pocket where they could be destroyed. General Harold Alexander, the overall Allied commander in Italy, issued clear orders to General Mark Clark, commander of the 5th Army, advance northeast from Anzio to cut Highway 6 at Valmontone, blocking the German retreat route. Destroy the 10th Army. But Clark had a different priority. He wanted to be the first Allied general to liberate Rome. The race for Rome had become an obsession for Clark. The British 8th Army was advancing up the eastern coast of Italy, and Clark was convinced that if he didn't move fast, the British would get to Rome first and claim the glory. The political and propaganda value of liberating the Eternal City was enormous, and Clark wanted his name attached to it. So on May 25th, Clark made a decision that would define his legacy. He changed the axis of advance. Instead of sending the bulk of his forces northeast to Valmontone to trap the Germans, he sent them northwest, directly toward Rome. The 6th Corps commander, General Lucien Truscott, was furious. He argued that the original plan would destroy the German army and shorten the war. But Clark overruled him. "The capture of Rome is the only important objective," Clark said. The result was predictable. The Germans escaped. The 10th Army, which should have been surrounded and destroyed, slipped through the gap and retreated north to fight another day. Those German divisions would go on to form the backbone of the Gothic Line, the next major German defensive position, where they would kill thousands more Allied soldiers over the next year. Rome fell on June 4, 1944. Clark got his triumph. Newsreels showed him striding through the streets, accepting the adulation of Roman citizens. He became the liberator of Rome, the first Allied general to capture an Axis capital. But the celebration lasted exactly one day. On June 6th, the Allies invaded Normandy, and Rome was forgotten. Clark's moment of glory was buried under the avalanche of D-Day headlines. The controversy haunted Clark for the rest of his life. British commanders accused him of insubordination and glory hunting. American officers whispered that Clark had put his career ahead of the mission. Military historians still debate whether the destruction of the German 10th Army would have shortened the Italian campaign by months and saved thousands of lives. Clark defended his decision until his death in 1984, arguing that Rome was a legitimate strategic objective and that the Germans would have escaped anyway. But even his defenders admit that the decision was influenced more by ego than tactics. The cost? The German 10th Army survived to fight for another year. The Italian campaign, which some had hoped would end in the summer of 1944, dragged on until May 1945, and thousands of American, British and Canadian soldiers died fighting through the Gothic line against an enemy army that should have been destroyed at Valmontone. Number 4. General Lloyd Fredendall's dispositions before Kasserine Pass, February 1943, North Africa. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was the first major engagement between American and German forces in World War II. It was a disaster. American troops were routed, equipment was captured, and the myth of American invincibility was shattered in the Tunisian desert. Much of the blame falls on Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commander of 2 Corps. Fredendall was a pre-war officer who had impressed his superiors with his energy and confidence. General Eisenhower selected him to command the 2nd Corps in the invasion of North Africa, believing he was an aggressive, capable leader. But Fredendall turned out to be a catastrophic choice. His first mistake was location. Instead of positioning his headquarters near the front where he could monitor the battle, Fredendall set up his command post 70 miles behind the lines in a canyon near Tebessa. He ordered engineers to blast caves into the rock walls, using jackhammers and dynamite that should have been used to prepare forward defenses, to create a bomb-proof bunker complex for himself and his staff. While Fredendall was building his fortress, the frontline units were spread dangerously thin across the Tunisian mountains. The defensive positions were poorly chosen, often on forward slopes that exposed soldiers to German artillery. Units were scattered without mutual support. Communication lines were inadequate. Worse, Fredendall had a toxic command style. He micromanaged subordinates through radio messages, issuing contradictory orders and then blaming commanders when things went wrong. He clashed with British officers, whom he distrusted. He showed open contempt for one of his division commanders, Major General Orlando Ward, and repeatedly undermined Ward's authority. When German commanders Erwin Rommel and Hans-Jürgen von Arnim launched a coordinated attack through Kasserine Pass on February 19, 1943, the American defenses collapsed. The 168th Infantry Regiment was overrun. American tanks, spread out in small packets instead of concentrated for counterattack, were picked off by superior German armor. Artillery units were captured. Supply dumps were overrun. Entire battalions disintegrated as soldiers abandoned their positions and fled. The rout continued for days. At one point, Rommel's forces punched through the pass and threatened to break out into the Allied rear areas. Only desperate defensive stands by artillery units firing at point-blank range and the arrival of British reinforcements stopped the German advance. The Americans suffered 6,500 casualties, including 300 killed and 3,000 captured, many of them taken prisoner when their units were surrounded or overwhelmed. Mountains of equipment were lost or destroyed. The defeat shocked American commanders. Eisenhower visited the front and was appalled by what he saw. Soldiers had lost confidence in their leadership. Officers were making excuses. Discipline was crumbling. Within days of the battle, Eisenhower relieved Fredendall of command and replaced him with George S. Patton. Fredendall was sent back to the United States, where he spent the rest of the war training troops. The controversy centers on what could have been prevented. The Germans were always going to attack. Rommel was looking for a knockout blow before Allied reinforcements arrived. But Fredendall's poor dispositions, his remote command post, his failure to concentrate forces, and his toxic leadership created the conditions for a disaster. A more competent corps commander, positioned at the front and maintaining proper defensive positions, could have turned Kasserine into a defensive victory instead of a humiliating defeat. The 6,500 American casualties were, in the view of many historians, the direct result of Fredendall's failures. Eisenhower later called the decision to appoint Fredendall one of his biggest mistakes of the war. Number 3. The decision to continue the Hurtgen Forest offensive, September 1944 to February 1945. American casualties, 33,000 plus, possibly up to 55,000. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest is widely considered one of the most questionable operations in American military history. It's not controversial because of a single bad decision by a single commander. It's controversial because multiple commanders, at multiple levels, made the collective decision to continue an obviously failing offensive for 5 months. The objective was straightforward: clear the Hurtgen Forest and secure the Roer River dams to prevent the Germans from flooding the Roer Valley and blocking the Allied advance to the Rhine. But from the beginning, everything went wrong. The forest was a natural fortress. Dense tree cover negated Allied air superiority. The terrain, steep hills, deep ravines, narrow logging trails, favored the defenders. German engineers had fortified the forest with bunkers, minefields, and pre-registered artillery zones. Tree bursts from artillery shells detonating in the canopy turned every barrage into a rain of shrapnel and wooden spears. The First Army attacked in September 1944. Progress was measured in yards. Casualties were horrific. Entire companies were destroyed. The 28th Infantry Division lost 3/4 of its strength. The 4th Infantry Division was bled white. And yet, the offensive continued. Division commanders reported the appalling casualties and asked for the offensive to be called off, or at least paused. Corps commanders forwarded the reports to Army headquarters, but General Courtney Hodges, commander of 1st Army, and General Omar Bradley, commander of 12th Army Group, insisted the attack continue. Why? The reasons varied depending on who you asked. Some said momentum, stopping would hand the initiative to the Germans. Others said pride. Admitting the offensive was a mistake would be embarrassing. Still others pointed to the Roer dams, which remained a legitimate strategic concern. But as the weeks turned into months, it became increasingly clear that the Hurtgen was a meat grinder, consuming divisions for negligible gains. Units that had fought across France since D-Day were being destroyed in a claustrophobic forest battle that resembled World War I more than modern mobile warfare. The most damning critique came later, when military historians pointed out that the forest could have been bypassed entirely. The Americans could have masked the Hurtgen with screening forces and advanced around it to the north and south. The Roer dams could have been bombed or taken from the flanks. Instead, division after division was fed into the forest. The 28th Infantry Division, the 4th Infantry Division, the 8th Infantry Division, the 1st Infantry Division, the 9th Infantry Division. Each one went in at full strength and came out a shattered wreck. By the time the Americans finally cleared the forest in February 1945, they had suffered at least 33,000 casualties, with some estimates running as high as 55,000. And for what? The Germans had already withdrawn to prepared positions along the Roer. The dams, the original objective, were blown by German engineers as they retreated, flooding the valley anyway. The controversy isn't just about tactics. It's about the decision-making process. How did American commanders, who prided themselves on mobility and firepower, get sucked into a 5-month attrition battle in terrain that negated all their advantages? Why was the offensive allowed to continue when it was clearly failing? General James Gavin, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, later called Hurtgen a misconceived and basically fruitless battle that should have been avoided. Ernest Hemingway, who witnessed the fighting as a correspondent, compared it to Passchendaele, one of the worst bloodbaths of World War I. The soldiers who fought there called it the death factory, and the commanders who ordered them in never adequately explained why 33,000 casualties was an acceptable price for a forest that could have been bypassed. Number 2. Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's Plan, Eisenhower's Approval, September 1944. Netherlands. Operation Market Garden was one of the most ambitious operations of World War II. It was also one of the most controversial failures. The plan was conceptually elegant. Drop 3 airborne divisions to seize bridges across the major rivers in the Netherlands, creating a corridor that ground forces could use to punch through German defenses, cross the Rhine at Arnhem, and drive into the industrial heart of Germany. If successful, it could end the war by Christmas 1944. The architect was British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who convinced Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower to divert resources from the broad front strategy to support this narrow thrust. The problems started immediately. Intelligence reports indicated that 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting near Arnhem, exactly where the British 1st Airborne Division was supposed to land. Montgomery dismissed the reports as exaggerated. Major General Roy Urquhart, commander of the 1st Airborne, expressed concerns about the plan. He was told to follow orders. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped on September 17th to seize bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen. The British 1st Airborne dropped near Arnhem. And immediately, everything went wrong. The drops were scattered. Radio equipment failed. The ground forces advancing up the single highway, which became known as Hell's Highway, ran into stiff resistance and moved slower than planned. German reaction was faster and stronger than expected. At Arnhem, the British paratroopers found themselves fighting SS Panzer troops instead of the second-rate garrison units they'd been told to expect. Only a small force reached the bridge. The rest were surrounded and slowly destroyed in 9 days of brutal urban combat. At Nijmegen, the American 82nd Airborne faced a different nightmare. The critical bridge across the Waal River was still in German hands, defended by troops on both sides of the river. To take it, the 82nd had to execute a daylight river crossing under fire. On September 20th, troops from the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment paddled across the Waal River in flimsy canvas boats, while German machine guns and artillery shredded them. It was a suicide mission. But the paratroopers made it across, stormed the far bank, and captured the bridge. The problem? The British armored column that was supposed to exploit the crossing didn't show up. The tanks stopped for the night to consolidate. By the time they resumed the advance, it was too late to reach Arnhem. The British 1st Airborne was destroyed. Of the 10,000 men who dropped at Arnhem, only 2,000 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. The controversy has raged for 80 years. Who was responsible for Market Garden's failure? Montgomery blamed the weather, which delayed resupply drops. He blamed the unexpected strength of German resistance. He blamed the ground forces for moving too slowly. He never admitted the plan was fundamentally flawed. Critics point to multiple failures in conception and execution. Poor intelligence. The presence of SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem was known but ignored. Over-ambitious objectives. Dropping airborne forces 60-plus miles behind enemy lines and expecting a ground column to reach them in 48 hours was fantasy. Single axis of advance. The entire operation depended on one highway. If the Germans blocked it anywhere, the whole plan collapsed. Communication failures. Radios didn't work, leaving units unable to coordinate. But the most controversial aspect is Eisenhower's decision to approve the operation in the first place. Eisenhower was under political pressure. Montgomery was demanding resources for a northern thrust. Patton was demanding resources for a southern thrust. The broad front versus narrow thrust debate was tearing apart Allied command. Eisenhower chose Market Garden as a compromise. Give Montgomery a chance to prove his narrow thrust strategy could work. If it succeeded, great. If it failed, Montgomery would have to accept the broad front approach. Critics argue that Eisenhower approved an operation he didn't really believe in as a political maneuver to manage his subordinates. The price was paid by the British paratroopers at Arnhem and the American paratroopers at Nijmegen. The American casualties at Nijmegen included over 3,600 killed, wounded, or missing. Many of them from the 82nd Airborne's desperate river crossing. The British losses at Arnhem were catastrophic. And the strategic result? Zero. The Rhine crossing at Arnhem failed. The war didn't end by Christmas. Germany fought on for 8 more months. Military historians still debate whether Market Garden was a bold gamble that narrowly failed or a fundamentally flawed plan that should never have been approved. What isn't debatable is that 17,000 Allied casualties were the price of finding out. Number 1. General Patton's race to Messina, overtrapping the German army. July to August 1943. Sicily. Cost: 40,000 plus German troops escaped to fight another day. Thousands of future American casualties in Italy. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 was the Allies' first major operation in Europe. The strategic objective was clear: capture the island, knock Italy out of the war, and destroy the German and Italian forces defending it. If executed properly, the operation could trap over 60,000 Axis troops on an island with no escape route. Instead, it became a race between 2 Allied generals whose egos were bigger than their strategic vision. The plan called for General Bernard Montgomery's British Eighth Army to advance up the eastern coast toward Messina, the port city that controlled the straits separating Sicily from mainland Italy. General George Patton's U.S. Seventh Army would protect Montgomery's left flank and secure the western half of the island. Patton hated the plan. He hated playing second fiddle to Montgomery. He hated the idea of his army being relegated to a supporting role. And he absolutely refused to let Montgomery reach Messina first. So Patton changed his mission. Instead of focusing on trapping the German escape routes across the Strait of Messina, he launched a mad dash up the northern coast of Sicily, racing to beat Montgomery to the prize. The race became an obsession. Patton drove his divisions mercilessly, ignoring casualties, ignoring logistics, ignoring the fact that every mile his army advanced north was another mile that the Germans could use to evacuate their forces across the strait. The strategic situation was obvious to anyone looking at a map. The Germans were preparing to evacuate Sicily. They were pulling back to defensive lines, fighting, delaying actions, buying time to get their troops off the island. The Strait of Messina was less than 2 miles wide. If the Allies could cut the evacuation routes either by seizing the embarkation points or by interdicting the ferries with naval and air power, they could trap the entire German force. But that would require coordination. It would require the Allied commanders to focus on destroying the enemy instead of competing with each other. Patton wasn't interested in coordination. He was interested in glory. On the 17th of August, 1943, elements of Patton's 3rd Infantry Division rolled into Messina. They arrived hours before Montgomery's forces. Patton had won his race. He posed for photographs in the town square. He gave interviews to war correspondents. He sent a mocking message to Montgomery. This is a horse race in which the prestige of the U.S. Army is at stake. We must take Messina before the British. But by the time Patton's troops reached Messina, the Germans were gone. Over the previous week, German engineers had executed one of the most successful evacuations of the war. Using ferries, barges, and improvised rafts, they had transported 40,000 German troops, 10,000 vehicles, 47 tanks, and 94 artillery pieces across the Strait of Messina to mainland Italy. They did this despite Allied air superiority. They did this while fighting a rearguard action against 2 advancing Allied armies. They did it because neither Patton nor Montgomery made any serious attempt to stop them. The strategic failure was stunning. The entire point of invading Sicily was to destroy the German forces defending it. Instead, the Germans had executed an orderly withdrawal, evacuating the bulk of their combat power to fight another day. And where did those 40,000 German troops go? They went to Italy. They formed the core of the German defensive forces at Salerno, where they nearly threw the Allied invasion back into the sea. They fought at Monte Cassino. They fought in the Rapido River Valley. They fought at Anzio. They fought on the Gothic Line. For the next 2 years, American soldiers died fighting German troops who should have been captured or killed on Sicily. The controversy exploded immediately. British commanders accused Patton of grandstanding. American division commanders who had been driven mercilessly up the coast questioned why they had taken casualties racing to an empty city while the enemy escaped. Military analysts looked at the maps and asked the obvious question: why didn't the Allies close the trap? Patton's defenders argued that the evacuation was inevitable, that Allied naval and air forces couldn't stop the ferries, that the Germans would have escaped anyway. But that argument doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The Allies had naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. They had air superiority over Sicily. The strait was only 2 miles wide, well within range of artillery. A serious, coordinated effort to interdict the evacuation could have inflicted massive casualties on the Germans. But such an effort would have required Patton to slow down, to position his forces to block the evacuation routes, to coordinate with the Navy and Air Force. And that would have given Montgomery time to reach Messina first. So, Patton raced. He prioritized beating his rival over destroying the enemy. He turned a strategic operation into a personal competition, and 40,000 German soldiers lived to kill American GIs in Italy. The most damning evidence of Patton's priorities came in his own words. In his diary, he wrote about the race to Messina in terms of personal rivalry, not military strategy. He bragged about beating Montgomery. He reveled in the publicity. He never mentioned the Germans who escaped. The casualty count from Patton's decision is impossible to calculate precisely. How many American soldiers died in Italy fighting German troops that should have been captured on Sicily? Thousands, certainly. Perhaps tens of thousands when you add up the casualties at Salerno, Anzio, Cassino, and the Gothic Line. General Omar Bradley, Patton's immediate superior during the Sicily campaign, later wrote, "The overriding strategic purpose of the Sicilian campaign was the destruction of enemy forces. In this, we failed. The Germans escaped to fight another day, and they fought very well indeed." British Field Marshal Harold Alexander was more blunt. "Messina was a consolation prize that cost us the real victory." Even Eisenhower, who admired Patton's aggressive spirit, privately questioned the decision. In correspondence after the war, he acknowledged that the focus on reaching Messina ahead of the British had allowed the Germans to escape. But Patton never admitted fault. To the end of his life, he defended the race to Messina as a necessary boost to American morale and prestige. He argued that beating the British mattered, that showing the world that American soldiers could outfight and outmarch their allies was worth the strategic cost. The soldiers who died in Italy might have disagreed. If you found this examination thought-provoking, leave a comment with your perspective on these decisions. Military history isn't just about what happened, it's about understanding why and whether it had to be that way. Subscribe for more deep dives into the difficult questions of World War II.